welcome to Two Women Yelling About Knitting, a show that is not about what we're buying or what we're making, but instead asks questions like, is it possible to hate knitting with acrylic yarn without hating on people who knit with acrylic yarn? This is a space where we will look up from our works in progress and acquisitions and talk about what we see in the wider world of knitting, its political, social, and historical context. But don't worry, it'll be fun. I'm Anjali, and I'm a knitter in Denver, Colorado.
I'm Allison, and I'm a knitter living outside of Washington, D.C. We're friends who share a love of knitting as well as an interest in a lot of sticky topics that relate to knitting. Things like traditional gender roles, consumerism, body liberation, and more. We are recording a 6-episode season with a new episode and a new topic every 2 weeks. If you want to join us on this journey, hit the subscribe button to follow along.
Our opening question for today's topic, which is all about yarn choice, is what was your first yarn that you ever knit with, and why did you choose it?
Great question. I learned to knit the summer I was 15 years old, almost 30 years ago. A bit of a memory, but I do think it was Barocco. And it was some sort of blue, and I have to imagine it was acrylic, not wool. I teach a lot of knitting these days, and we often start with acrylic yarn. It's cheaper to source. That definitely may have been why I picked it. And also just is very forgiving when it comes to mistakes. So I think I picked it because I liked the color. It was for a scarf, and I was a new knitter, and it was what was advised as the best option for that stage of knitting and that project. How about you, Anjali?
So I learned to knit from the Stitch and Bitch book that came out in the early 2000s, and I was just out of college, and I had learned how to crochet as a child but had never knit. And I think in that book she recommends, I just remember her recommending Brown Sheep Wool Company. And so I was like, okay, that's what I want to start with. So I think it was like a worsted weight. I do remember it was like a bright turquoise color, like a very saturated turquoise color, 100% wool. So that was, I feel like that was a good yarn to start with. Because I was just teaching myself from a book, it took a long time of just like, what is happening? And so that was a good yarn to like knit and then knit and unravel, like as I was learning how to do things.
I think I also went to a local yarn store. My grandmother lived in Maine, and I was in Maine that summer because my dad's sister taught me to knit, and that's where we would usually see each other. And there was a local yarn store there, the Cashmere Goat, where I still go in Camden, Maine. And so I imagine that must have been where I went. And I know I would have gotten really good advice there. You know, we start with this question because this is what we're looking at today. How do people choose yarn? What are the decision points that go into deciding what yarn you're going to use? And I think a little theme of this podcast will be like, I am interested in maybe the more technical and or historical side of things. And Anjali is more interested in and definitely an expert on contemporary sociology and maybe more of like a consumer psychology side of things. So I will start talking about the actual qualities of the yarn that we look at when we're making decisions about yarn. Fiber source, is that a plant, an animal, a synthetic? The properties of that yarn, right? How elastic is it? Is it washable? How warm will it be? How durable is it? The color, which we both clearly, it's like we sort of maybe remember the fiber, but what we really remember is the color. And that can be affected by things like the fiber that it's made on. But all different color options, variegated yarn, natural dyes versus synthetic dyes. Other things that we consider that I don't know, I can certainly say I did not consider in that first yarn purchase, but that I've thought more about in years since, the costs behind the yarn, both for myself, but also for the producer of the yarn. What is that supply chain, that chain of creation, and what are the costs associated with it? And what are my out-of-pocket costs then when I go to buy it? And then also like the source and or creator of the yarn. Am I getting it online? Again, not so much an option back when we started, certainly an option now. Who is making this yarn? How much do I know about them? And how much does that factor into my choices, right? We have huge, Lion Brand, big corporate yarn. We have tiny little indie dyers, not always clear where their fiber comes from per se, but they certainly are like dyeing their own yarn out in their backyard, dye studios. And then in between companies, Knitting for Olive, Brooklyn Tweed, there is maybe a little more understanding or transparency around their process, but they're not like a tiny little individual person. They are sort of a corporate entity in between those two. So we thought we would look at two very different yarns to think about all these different factors that play into what creates a yarn and then how those factors affect how we choose them. So we have two yarns here today, a little show and tell, some Shelter from Brooklyn Tweed that I got before the end, which I'm so glad I have now, and it feels extra special. Oh my gosh, it's Old World. I had waited so long when this was out of stock. It's this beautiful dark blue with like flecks of, their Shelter, which has the kind of tweed heathered effect. And then Bernat, I think I'm going to say it correctly, Softy, chunky. I love the double E versus the Y in the spelling of Softy and chunky. I truly do. It makes me happy. So we're going to look at each of these. Okay, so company-wise, we have our Brooklyn Tweed, based in Portland, Oregon, started by Jared Flood, until about a month ago, creator of yarn and patterns, now just a creator of patterns, but very clear online presence. Jared is very involved kind of in everything that they do. So that's that company. And then Bernat, which is based in Ontario, actually. It is owned by Spin-Rite Yarns, which is, according to their website, the largest marketer of craft yarns in North America. They also own Red Heart, Susan Bates, some other companies you probably heard of.
Angela here with an update. As we were doing the finishing touches on this episode and doing some final research, we discovered that actually Spin-Rite Yarns is closing their manufacturing facility and retail store, which is located in their original location of Listowel, Ontario, Canada. And the company is owned by two American-based private equity firms who have made the choice to close down this facility that's been in operation for over 70 years. If you haven't already heard about some of the ways that private equity is dabbling in the yarn and craft space, I definitely recommend taking a look at Knit with Deborah's video on that topic, which we will link to below.
I was interested to find out that this was based in Ontario, and as far as I could tell, also made in Canada. Fiber content, big point of difference between these two yarns. I would say actually, so this is, chunky, a little bit thicker. This is a worsted weight. But, and the color is very different. But in terms of thickness, you're going to get not that different a product out of it. So this is American Targhee Columbia wool, non-superwash. The wool is from Wyoming, right? So again, Brooklyn Tweed, RIP, their yarns, but they were so transparent about how their yarn was made and kind of every step of the process, right? So the wool came from Wyoming, sheep in Wyoming. It was scoured in Texas at Bowman Industries. Those of you who've read Vanishing Fleece will recognize that name. The heathered colorways like this one were dyed at the Bowman Hat Company in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And then it was spun and finished at Harrisville in New Hampshire, which also makes their own yarns. Again, less transparency or less information on the internet with Bernat. So from the best of my investigative research, I'll share what I found. So acrylic, this is 100% acrylic, which is a petroleum-based plastic, essentially, at the end of the day. The whole history of acrylic fiber is really interesting. I will not go too much down a rabbit hole about that. It was invented in the 1940s by DuPont to compete with nylon, which was the other non-animal, non-plant fiber at that time. I do think non-plant. Where, again, it's a chemical, so there's not a kind of same kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, like through line or traceability, thank you, that you have with the Brooklyn Tweed wool. But it's, a chemical that is spun into yarn. The mill is in Canada. Properties. So what do you get from these yarns? What is your final product going to be like? So Shelter, another thing I love about Shelter is that it is woolen spun and it is labeled as woolen spun. Again, that's something we can get into. I am a newish spinner, so I'm starting to really understand these things. But that is a way of spinning the yarn that makes it warmer. It's not worsted spun, it's woolen spun. So this is going to be extremely warm. It is not machine washable. Do not dare put this in the washing machine or, God forbid, dryer. It's going to have a nice kind of like bounce back and memory because it's not super wash, but it is also less durable. So woolen spun has more air in it. It is, easy to break with your hands. So those are the properties of this. The properties of our Softy Chunky. It's going to be less elastic. It is absolutely machine washable, but those kinds of yarns can sometimes sag over time or lose their shape. It is super machine washable. Should you be, I love a baby present made in non-super wash yarn, but I also absolutely see the value in being able to throw something for a child into a washing machine. It is super durable. It will not disintegrate in a landfill for hundreds of years. It's not going to fall apart if you treat it a little
for better
roughly.
Or for worse.
Right, exactly. Impervious to moths, also a nice quality. It's hypoallergenic, right? So there are many people out there allergic to wool who are not going to be allergic to plastic. Something I learned recently that's very interesting, the microplastics are in the conversation now, and this releases a lot of washing acrylic releases a lot of microplastics. So again, we're here, we're just asking questions. We're just sharing information. This is not to say these are good or bad things, but we are both believers that the more you know, the better equipped you are to make decisions that are good for you. Moving on to dye. So I actually couldn't find a lot of information about the dye components in terms of Brooklyn tweed. I have to imagine it is to some degree, again, synthetic. What that means can mean probably a number of different things, but I don't think you're going to get these colors not synthetically. This would definitely be a synthetic dye. It's interesting. This is a bit of a tangent, but I'm sure it will come up as the season progresses. Anjali specifically has a background in food systems, and we talk a lot about the parallels between like yarn talk and food talk. So I was just thinking in terms of the definition of acrylic or the definition of synthetic fiber, right? The same language around like the definition of organic, like to label something legally as organic versus what it means in a more casual sense or organic sense, if you will. It's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And just sort of the same sort of judgments around eating organic versus eating conventionally raised produce and things like that.
Right. With the same thing, we're a little bit today, judgments and conventions around using synthetic fiber versus natural fiber. Probably the biggest difference in the comparison here, aside from the fiber content itself, is kind of the labor costs that go into it. So just thinking about how this wool, so I'm very excited for a book coming out called The True Cost of Wool. I maybe will link to it or something. It focuses really on the Canadian wool industry. But from what I've seen of the author, she talks a lot about just how does wool not even get from the sheep, grow on the sheep and then become yarn, and just all the steps that have to happen in between to make that happen. Shepherds, shearers, scours, dyers, spinners, the companies themselves. There's so many different steps and costs associated with those steps. So many more labor costs go into this. Again, not as much information about the Bernat. It is manufactured in Canada. Plenty of people have to work in a mill to make it operate. How you get from the chemical to the mill is a bit of a mystery in terms of my research, but it is not as many steps as required to make pure wool.
And like with food, the fewer or just any industry, the fewer people in between you and the finished product, the cheaper it is, generally.
Right. Again, for better or worse, right? Like the idea of going to a farmer's market and buying directly from a farmer. But in this case, it's almost the opposite, right? We have this shorter process, but it wouldn't be the equivalent of the farmer's market.
Yeah. So, or eating at McDonald's versus the Michelin starred restaurant in your town, where with McDonald's, it just comes, it's already been packaged. You just have to take these simple steps versus a more complicated skill-based process.
Which then is reflected in the cost. So 140 yards of shelter would used to set you back about $16.50, whereas 109 yards of our Softy Chunky is $5.50. And then the last piece of the puzzle is, where did I get these yarns? Brooklyn Tweed, again, RIP. And I'm not ashamed to say, I got this on Amazon. My daughter loves this yarn. She uses it for finger knitting. Endless finger knit chains. And I, as I said, I teach knitting, and kids like love this yarn. They are drawn to it. They want to use it. It won't fall apart in their hands. They love the color changes.
It's probably
so I
really
got like a
soft.
6-pack. So interestingly, I think they may have changed their formula. The last batch of this
Not
I got
as softy as it said.
not as soft, chunky, but not as softy. It's like very squeaky, which is definitely something I notice in acrylic yarn. So there must obviously there are differences, right? Like the idea that you could have a squeakier acrylic than less squeaky, and or something that is more imitative of real wool. So it's got to have a different process or a different component going on. But again, just not a ton of transparency. So that's kind of like, right, the makeup of the yarn, what's inside these yarns and what goes into making them themselves. But then there are a whole bunch of other things that may influence how you make these decisions.
Yeah. And I think just a sort of common refrain in the knitting space, maybe not like outwardly spoken, is just that your yarn choice says something about you as a person. And I think often that's almost weaponized, where, if you're choosing a really high-priced yarn, maybe one that is American sourced, then that is saying that you are the specific type of consumer. If you choose a hand-dyed yarn that sells out in minutes when they make their next drop, like that also says something about you. If you're just buying acrylic Softy Chunky and using it to knit blankets, I think that says something about you in people's minds. So I just was interested in thinking a little more about, what does yarn choice say about us? Not in a judgmental way, but just around the conditions of our lives and our knitting. Just to kind of put things in context, I think, we both talked about in our first choices of yarn, like, where did we find that yarn? And I think where you live and your sort of yarny community really influences what choices you might make. Of course, now there's many more options available over the internet, but if you want to see things in person and touch them, if you have access to a good local yarn store, versus if you live in an area that only has access to big box yarn stores or big box craft stores, that can really influence what you're able to choose. So America's Knitting did a survey, or does like a regular survey of LYS's, local yarn stores, in the United States. And in January of 2020 was the last data that they released, but there were 944 local yarn stores in the US. And that's down from about 1,400 in 2008. So I can only imagine, just seeing what's happened in my local community, that probably that number has dropped since 2020. I don't know if you've seen anything in your area, Allison.
Well, because I used to live in Pittsburgh, and now I live here. And I actually am surprised, in the DC area, there are a few really good LYSs, but not a ton. But I do think, this is another thing we've talked about in the last, I don't know, maybe like 2 months. It just feels like there's been a lot of chatter about businesses struggling, whether that's like creators of yarn, small yarn stores, designers packing up shop. But I do think, that there has been a downward trend. Is it too expensive? Is it too volatile? Is it, whatever the reasons are, it does seem to be going that way. That's the vibe. I have no data, but that's what it feels like, for sure.
Yeah, here in Denver, I was excited because there was actually a worker-owned cooperative craft store that stocked a lot of great yarns called Fancy Tiger, and they just shut down.
No.
And it was kind of, the writing was on the wall, like they had to move because of rent. Like rent in Denver skyrocketed, and then they just kept I don't know. They were just struggling. So it's a big bummer.
And that is something, I mean, and that's just something that's so interesting to me. The like juxtaposition of this thousands of years old craft and practice and people still doing it, right? Like somebody knitting today and somebody knitting 500 years ago would probably be able to identify what the other one is doing. But the way that just the conversation around how that happens, whether it's like online shopping or increased, you know, rents or global commerce, whatever it is, like all the things around it have changed so much and affect it in such different ways, which is part of why we started this podcast, to kind of look at those things, because they're interesting.
Yes. So in January 2020, 944 LYSs in the US. In 2020, there were 4,380 Walmarts in the US. So clearly more accessible for many more people. There was also a survey that was kind of looking at where people spend their money and how much they spend on yarn. So younger consumers in the 25 to 34 age bracket spent about $411 online shopping for yarn versus $215 in stores. They also spent basically almost the same amount as those in the 55 to 64-year-old age bracket, which is interesting because you would think that the oldest yarn consumers, not the oldest, but like those who are older than those in the youngest age bracket would be spending more money just because they probably have
more money,
more financial stability.
Right.
But actually it was kind of close. So what that says to me is that younger people are maybe willing to spend more on yarn. And see, I don't know whether that's because of knitting influencers who are telling them to choose these types of yarn, or just kind of making it more appealing than maybe like big box acrylic yarn, or whether it's knitting designers who are recommending specific yarns that are maybe a little more expensive in their patterns. I don't know what the exact reasoning is, but apparently younger people spend more on yarn relative to their likely income and definitely prefer shopping online. So I don't know what that means for the future of LYSs, but I don't know. Personally, I like being able to like go into a store and touch yarn, and in particular for me, just seeing the color in person, like that's really hard to replicate online. But at the same time, I do buy a lot of yarn online just because it's very convenient.
Yeah, I buy, as I said, I mean, there are some LYSs here, but I also hate driving. And most of them are pretty far away from me. And I do find myself coming back to brands that I know and then ordering them online because I know what it's going to feel like. I know what it's going to be. And I don't necessarily need to touch it. I also have too much yarn at this point in my life. And I wonder how much of that actually might have to do with age as well, where it's like
maybe
older people don't need to buy more yarn because I'm only middle-aged. We did think about calling this podcast to middle-aged women yelling about knitting. And I have so much yarn, I had to stop myself.
Yeah.
Whereas bright-eyed 22-year-olds don't have a stash that takes up a room in their house yet, so they have more
not yet
space. Yeah, exactly. My in-person buying mostly happens at yarn festivals, which I will drive for and which I'm a huge fan of, and which I hope we will do an episode on at some point in the future. So I do, if I have a specific project in mind, usually for somebody else, I like know a yarn that I've already worked with, I'll buy it online. But for kind of like fun, what am I going to find today? Like try something new. I will usually save that for yarn festivals over a yarn store.
Okay. Yeah, I've never been to a yarn festival yet, so
I see that in
it's
our future together.
Yeah. Yeah. So, your yarn choice says something maybe about where you live and your age, how you like to shop. And I was interested to find a article in a scholarly fiber journal from the Journal of Textile Design Research and Practice that was kind of talking about what sort of characteristics of a yarn might influence our choices. And is that different between people who choose more commercially produced yarn versus artisanal yarn? So this article, which we will link in the comments or the notes, is called Yarn Design Characteristics Which Influence Crafters to Consume Either Artisan Brand Yarns or Commercial Yarns, by Casey Stannard and Kathy Mullett. And this article is from 2015. So it was using something called levels of emotional design to look at mostly knitters. They also talked to some crocheters and weavers, but mostly knitters, fiber choices. This is a framework from Donald Norman that looks at 3 theoretical categories of design. So the first is visceral. This level is reliant upon the features that are sort of outward, like that we use our senses to feel, such as look, taste, and sound.
I love tasting my yarn. But yes, as a general category.
People do talk about the smell of their yarn.
Oh, 100%. I mean, like sheepy. That's a really good point. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you talk to our husbands and said, people love to smell yarn, do you think they would think that was something
normal?
you might
right.
think about? Probably not.
It's funny. There was something happened. I think I brought home an extra sheepy yarn, or like I had a bunch of yarn in the car. So my younger child got in and she was like, it smells like a sheep in here. And I was like, yes, it does. Now you know enough to know what that smells like.
Yes. So visceral, the sheepy level. Behavioral is kind of the level that describes how functional or usable something is. So like, is it actually serving its purpose? And then the third level is reflective. So this is all based on like intangible emotional concepts. So about message, culture, and like the meaning of a product for someone.
Which is so interesting because, right, the question here was how do we not judge other people for their yarn choices? But that to me says, and understandably so, because it's true with everything we purchase. Again, food, other things, but it's like we think it's saying something about us. We're not necessarily just judging other people, but we think, what does this say to me about me?
Yes. And so about me to others, and then about me to myself. So this study used a survey that had 35 items that they were trying to determine what specific yarn design characteristics sort of enticed crafters to consume either artisan brand yarns or commercial yarns. So they asked questions about people's crafting habits, their consumption of raw materials, and their demographics. And then the participants were asked to recall details about a specific favorite craft project and characteristics of the yarn that they used to make that project, including the fiber type, the weight, and some aesthetic considerations. And then also asked if the yarn had any of the following features: if it was hand-dyed, if it was hand-spun, or if it was of a farmstead origin. So was it coming from like a small scale producer? So if it was yes to any of those 3 things, then that was categorized as an artisan yarn. So I think by that definition, like a Brooklyn tweed shelter wouldn't fall under artisan. So I feel like there is sort of this
and this is
hazy
where like
middle where you're not quite choosing a fully like, I don't know,
right,
like the most
artisan,
efficient commercial yarn. And
right,
it's also not.
But this is again where I think the language is so interesting. And how things are allowed to be labeled legally, regulation-wise, for consumer protection in many cases. But the idea of farmstead, right? Like not this. I mean, this tells you it's from Wyoming, but Brooklyn Tweed did do a series of yarns that were like ranch specific. Right. Would that count as farmstead?
I think
farm
so.
Ranch? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would be. That would count as farmstead. So yeah, and then I just got some Harrisville design. They have like a limited edition sheer that comes from every year. They do like one release of this yarn that's from a specific ranch. So I think
I bet
that would
it's good.
count, but yeah.
But then what's so interesting to me is hand dyed counts, which is
Right.
the absolute last step in the process, which totally tons of hard work, somebody's backyard, their livelihood, but also could be sourcing that yarn from who knows where.
Right,
And like
yeah.
every other step in the process would not be considered artisan, but then this last step is.
But this
Which
was
I-
also 2015, so I also wonder like how much was there available in that kind of middle ground.
And I think is also just worth pointing out because it does come back to kind of one of our central things, I think, with this podcast is that there are not easy answers. Like, we're not actually here to answer any of these questions because the idea that it's like, what's the question? Here's the answer is not really applicable to many of the ideas that we're interested in. But just to be able to say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And now you have more information, even if you don't have an answer.
Yeah, and just talk about it because it's interesting. You know, as people were thinking about their favorite project and the yarn that they used, if they said yes to any of those three things, hand dyed, hand spun, or farmstead origin, then they were categorized as the crafter choosing an artisan product. Everyone else was grouped into the commercial yarn category. And so then they were comparing these two groups, the artisan versus the commercial yarn, and seeing how these different design characteristics, how important they were to these two different groups, and looking for differences between the two groups. So they were asked about two aspects of every level. So two questions about the visceral level asked about the importance of color and visible texture. For the behavioral level, they were asked about the importance of the yarn being a suitable weight, like DK, fingering, whatever, and then the feel of the yarn. And then two asked about the reflective level, the desire to support the business selling the yarn, and the consideration of the origin of fiber. So that was the survey. There were 657 respondents. You'll be shocked to know that 95% identified as female. 80% were 18 to 40 years old, which skews a little young, I think, for the sort of fiber arts crowd. But they did recruit online mostly.
I was going to say,
and
it's
they
like,
used,
right,
yeah, the snowballing where you ask someone who responds to like forward it to people they know, so it makes sense. 70% of the projects recalled were knitting, so this skewed more towards knitting, and 24% used artisan yarns, so about a quarter of respondents, and the majority was hand-dyed, so 21% used hand-dyed.
Which
Just
makes sense.
3% used farmstead, which also makes sense.
Yeah.
Just availability.
I have some farmstead stories, like, you know, in that how you make decisions. It's a bit of a tangent, but how you make decisions. I had this like gorgeous farmer's market bought from the shepherd yarn. It was so great and it felt so local, and I cannot wear it without like 2 layers of turtlenecks underneath because it is that itchy for me. So decisions being made on different levels, but I loved the farmsteadness of it.
Yes. Yeah. So that sounds like a lot of reflective, maybe less of the behavioral feel of the yarn. So 35% of respondents used a wool yarn and 29% used acrylic, and the rest used other fibers. So looking at the two groups, those that chose artisan yarns and those that chose commercial yarns, there wasn't a significant difference in the importance of color. Color was very important to both groups, which again, I think we've alluded to earlier. We both remember the color of the first yarn that we chose. And visible texture was more important to the artisan yarn users. And the researchers thought that maybe this is like a reaction to the mass production sort of yarn all looks very much the same. And having a different sort of texture is like a reminder that you're choosing this artisan product that has more maybe human hands coming into it, and also could perhaps reflect a consideration of different breed types. So this kind of
and or like processing. Like I don't know how, if it's possible, but right, like we talked a little bit earlier about woolen spun versus worsted, and then there's like a whole bunch of grade levels in between, and I don't know how possible that is. Obviously, that is something more thought about in something like a hand spun, which counts as artisan. So yeah,
right, yeah, and I feel like this is bringing me also towards a theory of your yarn choice says something about where you are in your knitting journey. And, you know, at the beginning of my knitting journey, and honestly, until I came back to knitting just a few years ago, which we'll talk about in a later episode, I really did not think about the different qualities of different types of yarn. I didn't know anything about different breed types, or how that might affect how a yarn feels. I didn't know about woolen spun versus worsted spun, all of these sort of aspects that affect the texture. I had no idea about. So yeah, I think that also, and it's not a good or bad thing, but just kind of you're learning as you continue to knit about what makes yarns different.
And I like what you just said about it's not good or bad. Like we are stating things here. It's like older people do this, younger people do this, which I think on its surface could look contradictory to the question we're asking, which is how do we not judge people? It's like, oh, well, I'm telling you how old this person is based on what they're using. But there's a difference between information and judgment, I think, right? Things can be facts without having to attach value labels to them, which I think is what we're kind of digging into here.
Yeah, and what is value? It's very personal.
Right.
One of the surprising findings was that yarn weight was significantly more important to artisan yarn users. So that was just surprising because you would think that, you know, it would be important to not use a fingering weight on a product or on a project that calls for worsted weight yarn. But I think you talked about that if you are knitting garments, then yarn weight is more important. And I definitely in my own knitting journey feel that I never even knew what yarn weight was again.
Right. That's what you were
I was
just saying.
knitting
it's
accessories.
About your knitting journey.
Yeah. I was just knitting like a scarf, like, you know,
you make it as wide as you're going to make it.
Like, yeah. Fingerless mitts. It doesn't matter. Like you just kind of do what you do and you can adjust things, and usually it doesn't make a huge difference. Whereas if you are knitting a garment, yarn weight makes a huge difference to the fits, if that finished garment is actually wearable. The
concept of gauge was completely foreign to me.
Never.
I mean, for many years. Yeah.
Like, why would I do that? So I think that also is kind of a reflection of this idea that your yarn choice also says reflects your just experience with knitting and fiber arts and how much you know about what you need to do in order to get a good product. And also, honestly, like I think nowadays it's more common for knitters to be like, oh, and then I knit a scarf and then I knit a sweater, just to immediately jump into a more ambitious project because of the availability of YouTube tutorials,
the internet,
and yes. And that was not available to me as an early knitter in the early 2000s. And so I didn't knit a sweater until I came back to knitting a few years ago because it was too intimidating.
Yeah, I knit maybe we'll do an episode on this. I knit my first sweater my first adult sweater in 2016.
Yeah.
20 years after I learned to knit. And I think that's an interesting thing too about this idea of knitting journey, because you see people on the internet who are like, I learned to knit 18 months ago and here's my Fair Isle sweater. And then I know people who maybe like knitting acquaintances I've had where we've been talking about, you know, it's like, oh, let me show you this cool sweater pattern that I discovered. And they're like, I'm not interested in knitting garment. Like I am reached this level of knitting and that's what makes me happy. And that's where I'm going to stay. And like, that's fine too. Like knitting journey doesn't always equate to time spent. Knitting,
or like, or even sort of challenging constantly. I mean, I feel like it's just such an American thing to be like, I always have to be besting myself.
Do something new, getting better.
And especially with knitting, which can just be like a soothing, relaxing hobby. That can just be doing whatever is soothing and relaxing to you. That yarn feel is more important to artisan yarn users, I think also for me hits home with just actually having enough experience with different types of yarn to know what type of feel I like. Like I now love woolen spun yarns because I have used them and have the knowledge to know that I am using a woolen spun yarn and kind of what that means, and identifying that like, oh, this feels really good.
Again, a bit of a tangent, but a woolen spun tangent. I knit a blanket in Shelter 15, 20 years ago. And it was a gift, and I gave it to these people, and they were like, "Why is this blanket so warm?" And I was like, "I don't know. I guess I did a great job knitting it." And only in the last couple of years was I like, "Oh, it's so warm because it's woolen spun." It was ridiculous. It was full, it was like lace pattern, and yet so warm. And it was this like mystery that was finally solved because I began to understand what woolen spun meant.
Yeah.
And yet, I'm
magic.
just thinking in terms of yarn feel too, the feeling of yarn, I think there's also a difference. My cautionary tale of my unwearable sweater, knitting with it in the moment was fine. And then the final thing was so itchy too. So it's like, I think yarn feel, or for example, like a cotton or linen garment, love wearing it. It's a bit hard to knit. So the difference between like the yarn process, the feeling, and then the final product feeling is also something to take into consideration, and also not something you necessarily know until you've knit for a while.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And is totally personal. Like,
right.
It hurts my hands. Like I have tried using cotton linen blends, and it just hurts my hands. I like that.
Yeah.
And then it probably won't surprise you to know that there were significant differences on the reflective level, which was the level looking at like, do you have a desire to support the business selling the yarn, and are you considering the origin of the fiber? Is that important to you? So supporting local businesses and the ethical treatment of animals were more important to artisan yarn users than, a more important consideration when choosing their yarn than for the commercial yarn user group.
Interesting question. We have talked about the study before, but it just kind of occurred to me. Was cost not discussed as a factor?
They did not discuss cost. So it was just about, the design aspects of the yarn. So I think obviously like a lot of people are willing to, for one thing, they can afford that extra cost, but also they see these aspects about the business and sort of the ethics of their purchases as important enough to outweigh the greater cost of these yarns. Yeah, my conclusion about all of this is that our yarn choices say something also about where we are on our knitting journey, how much knowledge we have around knitting and yarn, and personally how we want to spend our time knitting and what we want to spend our time with as we knit.
Yeah. And I think we've alluded to these, but part of what inspired this question were these yarn beefs out in the atmosphere, like natural versus not natural, which again, as we've discussed, can feel a lot like the organic versus not organic food discussion. And also just when you really dig into it, what those labels might mean and how things are made. And it's not necessarily always going to be what it looks like on the surface. Like, for example, again, alluding to hopefully later in our season, that all wool grown in the United States is 100% ethically made, and like nobody suffers in the process of making it because of that. And that might not be true. So just the idea that it's hard to know exactly what you're even necessarily getting just based on surface labels.
Well, also, and just thinking, it's funny to think about natural versus not natural, because in the study we just talked about, hand-dyed yarn was categorized as artisan, but a lot of hand-dyed yarn is superwash, like treated yarn.
Another great part of this natural versus not natural.
Because
you can have 100%.
Like the colors are brighter,
right?
But that is a treated yarn that sometimes they put like a polymer on it in order to make it superwash. There's different processes they can do, but I've also seen people be like, I don't like superwash because I don't like knitting with plastic coated yarn. So,
but again, it would be 100% wool,
right?
be considered. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Cost, of course, is just a huge beef because, as we know, everyone likes to judge how everyone else spends their money. And there have been some sort of controversies over the years about designers, knitwear designers, suggesting yarns that were at higher price points and not also suggesting alternatives that are more affordable for people. So I know some designers like Andrea Mowry have like a sort of appendix to their patterns that have a full list of different yarn options. And that is one great thing about, you know, sites like Ravelry or Instagram, where you can see what other yarns people are using to knit designs and like find something that is more within your price point. And so I do think there is a push to be more democratic and sort of open about the price points that people can, especially with something like a sweater, which requires a large amount of yarn, like what is affordable and sustainable for people to be able to continue their hobby at a way that works with their budget.
Yeah, which ties into like, it's not necessarily a separate beef, but the relationship between yarn and class is very interesting, and again, historically based. You know, the idea, again, a big generalization, but that acrylic is maybe used more in crochet. Again, is that simply about cost and class, or is that about the properties of the fiber being better for one craft or another? But a lot of judgments coming into play in terms of what our choices say about our social status, which again have like historical underpinnings in like a knitting versus crochet kind of way. So yeah, so just these different ways that we judge each other based on these categories, and at least identifying them as a way of maybe then letting them go.
Yeah, and we also want to talk a little bit about like our own personal biases and how we choose yarn, because everyone has them and we're not immune. And that's, you know, we're not saying that you should be like thinking about yarn in a way that is totally logical and makes sense. You know, we make specific choices based on our own appreciation for different aspects of yarn, but that doesn't judge anyone else for making different choices. So we wanted to close out the end of the meaty section of today's episode with just talking about like a popular yarn that we just don't like for whatever reason, because, you know, how a yarn makes you feel is just kind of a very personal, intangible thing. And then a yarn that just makes us feel good to knit with. So, Allison, what is a popular yarn that you just can't like?
So I purchased and attempted to knit multiple times and still have sitting somewhere in a pile some Knitting for Olive cotton merino, which I see beautiful things made in. It is, I think I generally don't love fingering weight, and it is, I would call it even like finer fingering weight yarn. And again, it may be that it like, my tension just seemed really not good when I knit with it. Like I didn't love the feel of it in the moment. And then I also wasn't loving how it looked knit up, which may be because that's like I'm a weird like hybrid continental knitter, and maybe something about the combination of my knitting style and this fiber like did not create a lovely product. And I hope to, I don't know, put it to good use someday, but it might just sit there, and I probably actually should just donate it. Angeli, how about you?
So mine is also a European fingering weight yarn. Mine is Sandnes Garn Sunday. This is just my most recent experience of like, I know this is a really popular yarn. So I used it to knit the Stockholm beanie. I think that's the petite knit pattern that I used. It's just kind of like a ribbed beanie. It has a little bit of like fun shaping at the top. I was making it for my sister. So it's a lot of like, okay, just knit one, purl one, with this yarn that it just felt like boring, like just kind of like white bread, ultra processed, like not in a sort of how we're talking about acrylic yarn and like, oh, it's start to finish human made, but just in a like there is no visible texture. It is very smooth. It's very soft. The finished hat is soft and beautiful. And I think a lot of people maybe enjoy the yarn for that reason. But for me personally, I just want a little something more to keep it interesting.
And that makes me think too, I feel like there's a lot of talk in knitting. It's like the process knitter, the process spinner versus the product spinner or the product knitter. I think I'm a little more product oriented. Like I will power through something I don't love knitting with if I love, or even like styles of knitting that I like. I don't think I like color work that, like I just don't love color work, but I love how it looks and I will power through because I'm product knitter and product spinner. I like ply immediately because I like have to see what it looks like. Whereas there are plenty of spinners who are like, I have all these like singles, like I just spun a bunch of stuff and I left it because I finished spinning it and I don't need a final product. So again, that who am I in a knitting journey kind of way, like I really do love the final product. So I might power through something I didn't like, and maybe you're more of a process. I mean,
I think I am more of a process. Yeah, like if
Okay.
I don't like the process, I'll finish it because
Because
I mean, if I really hate it. I'm also someone who, if I start a book and I don't like it, I'm like,
yeah.
no, I don't need to finish this. But I've been finishing most things, even if I'm not crazy about the process. But I just remember, like, I don't like these projects where it's like on gigantic needles with yarn that's like not the right gauge. So it makes this really drapey but very fast to knit thing. But it's like all saggy. Like, I feel like that's also like a recent trend that I'm not crazy about. So anyway,
Yeah.
I'll just remember I don't want to do that again and look for those characteristics to know that I don't want to knit that pattern.
But what is a yarn you really like to knit with?
So I'm actually wearing one of my most favorite knitted things out of the yarn that I like working with that I thought of. So this is the Oversized Seasons cardigan by Ozetta. It's like a half fisherman's rib cardigan. And the yarn is Retrosaria Rosa Pomar Mungo, which is 50% cotton, 50% recycled wool. The cotton also might be recycled. So it's like the waste from their wool processing is then used to make this yarn. And it's just like feels a little bit crunchy, scratchy in the ball. Like it's not like a yarn that you pick up and you're like, ooh, this is wonderful. But it's just, I don't know. So this is the intangible thing. Like it is just a joy to knit with for me, and especially like in this like really textured pattern. It was just so fun to knit with. So this was my first cardigan and my first time knitting with that yarn, and I've since started knitting the Field Day cardigan also by Ozetta with a blue mungo for this season, because living in Denver, like this sort of 50% cotton 50% wool is a good almost all season wear for me. So
That makes me want to try a cotton wool blend. I feel like my personality is like all or nothing, and I tend to be a little bit all or nothing with my yarn. I'm like all cotton linen or all wool, like I can't do anything in between. But I think I need to give cotton there is a middle ground, and I need to give it a try. I live outside Washington, D.C., which is highly not conducive to year-round wool, unfortunately. I did get a nice day today to wear this, which I didn't even realize is going to relate to my wool or my yarn that I like to knit with, which is, again, I didn't really know much at all about breeds until I got into spinning. It was a quick descent into the spinning world in that I did a tour of breeds with Deb Robeson, who's like a big spinning person at the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival last year. And I was like, what is this world I know nothing about? Oh, all these people are spinners. Maybe I need to be a spinner. Less than a year later, I had a wheel, and now I do that all the time. So thinking about breeds, and then I go back to yarns I've liked and I've been like, oh, that's that breed, and that's that breed. And that breed would be Rambouillet. Just got at Maryland Sheep and Wool this year some Jill Draper Makes Stuff Rambouillet, which I love. And I'd done another sweater out of hers last year. And this is hand spun, I'm going to say it wrong, Shaniko. This is, we didn't take notes on this part. I'll look it up later, but I'm 90% sure that is a Merino Rambouillet like hybrid sheep. And then the main color is also a Rambouillet. It's just like, it's a very bouncy fiber. Sometimes it almost has a bit of like a cottony feel. Like a lighter weight, or not weight, because that's a technical term, but I don't know, there's something about it, again, yes, that intangible, but it is really enjoyable to knit with, and I find it very not itchy to wear.
I'll have to pay attention to if I have any Rambouillet.
I will spin you some Rambouillet and send it to you. That's what I'll do.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So I think it's Rambouillet for me.
Yeah. You know, what we were thinking about as we were thinking about this topic is just that if you're knitting a big project in particular, you spend more hours with the yarn than you do with most people in your life. I definitely...
I will make that choice. I will be like, I'm going to go be alone with my yarn and goodbye to my family.
Yeah. So it's totally personal, and how you choose to spend all that time is totally up to you. So
and
don't
all
let
that
anybody judge
money.
you.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's your time. It's your money. And how you choose to spend it is totally up to you. So don't let other people let you think that there's anything wrong with you for what choices you make.
I feel like these days I hear a lot of people apologizing for being allergic to wool. Like they're like, oh, well, I don't knit with wool. Like, oh, I'm knitting with this acrylic or this cotton or linen because I'm allergic to wool. And that, like, a subtext is that it makes me a bad person or something. Because I do think that there is that, you know, just now when I was like, I admit where I bought this from kind of thing. Like, it's in my head too. And it's just something to not let creep into the thing that you surely are doing because it brings you joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially people on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, the best and the worst, right? It's like I know how to knit because of the internet. Mm-hmm. I was taught the knit stitch, and everything else I've learned has been on the internet. And also, yeah, that's where I then decide I'm not a good knitter, or I'm not good enough, or see people being mean to each other about things that makes me feel bad.
Yeah.
So, double-edged sword.
So we're going to end our episodes with a short, fun segment. And the first part is going to be something knitting related and fun, or as we like to call it, two women happy about knitting. So, Allison, what is making you happy about knitting right now?
Yeah, so I, about a month ago, took a class at Maryland Sheep and Wool with Jillian Moreno called Yarnitecture, which is also her book, Yarnitecture. And it was all about spinning. And again, I am a novice, just spinning for about a year, had a wheel for not a super long time. And I've been interested in spinning and not so intentional about it, like kind of just like, oh, here, let's try this. But like, what do I want to do with this at the end? And so having taken her class, I feel like I've gotten better at thinking about what I'm doing with my spinning and then being able to envision how it will fit into a project, just in terms of yardage, in terms of the thickness of the yarn, all that kind of stuff. We're thinking about our own personal knit along, you and I, with the Lume. Oh. Are we saying that right? Mm-hmm. By Sari Nordlund. And so after taking that class, I spun up this little yarn baby, which I think will be my contrast color for our Lume knit along, with like a cream as my main color.
Yeah. Really
and it just felt, it was fun. It was exciting to do. And then it was like, oh, this is what I envisioned. And this is what I got, which I do remember going through that phase of knitting too, where you're like, here's this pattern and I got what I wanted it to look like, which still doesn't happen at all the time, but became a little more like predictable as I got more experienced. And so I feel like I've reached that stage.
So cool.
How about you, Anjali? What's making you happy about knitting?
We talked about a few weeks ago, or like a month ago, that I was interested in sock knitting. I've always thought that would be a good, just kind of, I like having something really simple on the side, and often in my past, like beanies have been that, but there's only, even in a cold place, there's only so many beanies one person can have.
You literally wear socks, can wear socks every day.
And I love... Yeah, and I don't have that many 100% wool socks, so I think I would definitely I need some more in my life. But I just like struggle, like I didn't want to do DPNs, and I tried socks with Magic Loop and just didn't love it. I just don't like having to like adjust the yarn. So I told you that I was going to try out some shorties and see how I liked it. And I like it.
Yay!
So, yeah.
What sock are you knitting?
I checked out the Summer Lee sock book from the library. So just like the very first one, which is basically like a version of her I'm So Basic sock, which is a free pattern online. These maybe
You have it.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, that's fun.
Oops. Yeah. So
that's good. That's a good yarn.
I think what inspired me to try was there's a YouTube podcast I like called Cozy Books and Knits. She talks about how she finally got into sock knitting when she tried out shorties because she just likes going like around and around and around and not having to think about the joins with DPNs or with magic loop. So I have found that to also be the case for me, and was worried about hand pain, but I think I figured out a way of holding the needles that is comfortable for me.
We didn't even get into that in this episode, but what your yarn choices say about you, or like maybe also how yarn choices can say something about you in a helpful way, right? Like it doesn't have to be judgment on yourself or on others. It can be like, what this says about me is that I know that this is my threshold for scratchiness when it comes to yarn that I want to wear. And so the yarns that I choose tend to be this. And then if I want to branch out, I have that information, which empowers me to make choices, new choices, if that's what I want to do. And it's the same with tools, right? Like everybody's got their favorite brand of knitting needle. I have the square ones that are like more ergonomic and better, supposedly. I don't love them, but I also am getting older and like feel my body falling apart. And I'm like, this might be really useful at some point. Like I don't have hand pain now, but maybe it will be down the line. So just thinking about like the choices you make in your tools as well, and feeling empowered to say, I know what I need in a tool and maybe I don't have that, but because I have that knowledge and awareness, I can then make a choice that will help me achieve what I want. And isn't that great?
It is.
We also want to have a little segment where we just talk about something that we can yell about other than knitting, but that is still fun. Angeli,
yelling in a good way.
Yeah, yes. All of this is yelling in a good way.
True.
Right? Most of the time.
Women can yell in a good way.
Yeah. Yes, they can. We're here to demonstrate. What is not knitting related in your life that is fun and worth yelling about?
So I have a group of friends that mostly, well, they're all parents, but mostly moms, who I have gotten to know over the past 4 or 5 years at my older kids' elementary school. But my older son is moving on to middle school, and all of the kids are going to different middle schools, so we're not going to be seeing each other in the same way all the time. So one of them organized a surprise karaoke night, started at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday.
Yes, my kind of party.
Yes, at this place called Punch Bowl Social in Denver, which has like bowling alleys and a bar, and you can order bar food. So we got a private room. She brought costumes, and we just sang mostly songs from the 90s.
Wait, were children there also?
No. Our children all had
adults.
Babysitters, so just adults.
Nice.
And it was just so much fun. And I haven't done karaoke in a long time. There's not a lot of places to do it here in Denver. In LA, I used to do it all the time, especially in my 20s. And so it was just a good reminder of like what a fun bonding experience that is with friends, to just like sing along to songs that you all love and or just know the words to.
That is very impressive.
What do you have a karaoke song?
I don't. If I had to, I don't know, it'd be like Joni Mitchell or something. One of those real crowd pleasers.
So do you have something not knitting related and fun that you want to share?
Not knitting related, in that it definitely was. I was like, oh, well, I was knitting while I was doing it, but it wasn't knitting related. So my husband and I historically have not agreed on things to watch on television. I will watch like the Lizzo backup dancer competition, and he will watch like Chernobyl, like in the peak of the pandemic. And I was like, I cannot watch this. The only TV shows we can agree on are a series that was on the BBC in like the 2000s, 2010s, that was a historical farm reenactment series.
Wow.
And so we are currently watching Edwardian Farm, and it's so good. Each episode is like almost an hour.
Is it a reality show?
Nobody's like kicked off. It's a reality show in that it is like, hi, we're historians on this farm.
Wow.
It's more like maybe documentary than reality. It's not a competition, but it's like two archaeologists and a historian who get together and put on, it's like Colonial Williamsburg as a television show, basically.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, okay, we did it.
This has been two women yelling about knitting. And as we mentioned at the start, we have a 6-episode series planned with episodes dropping every 2 weeks. So if these topics and just deeper conversations about knitting interest you, then please subscribe, follow along.
We're calling ourselves TWIAC for short, Two Women Yelling About Knitting, and also would love to hear from you if you have questions that you would be interested to hear us investigate and look into. So our email is twiac, TWYAK pod, all one word, twiacpod@gmail.com. You can reach us there as well.
Yeah, leave a comment. Let us know what is a yarn that everybody else loves that you don't love knitting with, or what's a yarn that just makes you happy on an emotional level to knit with for reasons that maybe you can't quite articulate.
Or perhaps what the first thing you ever knit was, and what that yarn was. Your knitting memories.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, engaging with you more, and putting out more of these episodes soon.
Thanks for watching.
Yeah.